You're lying still now, somewhere between the weight of the day and the soft quiet of night. Your body's ready to rest, and your mind, maybe it wants to drift gently through time. So, let's begin with a phrase you've likely heard. Your whole life, the Dark Ages, a gloomy name. It sounds like a time of extinguished lights, of libraries crumbling, of ignorance replacing ideas. It brings to mind images of muddy streets, closed shutters, plague bells, and villagers who didn't look up at the stars anymore. But was it really so dark? Or perhaps, have we simply dimmed the lamps of the past with our own shadows? Let's light one small candle, and we'll walk, slowly, through the quiet centuries that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. The phrase that painted 1,000 years black, the term Dark Ages, wasn't actually coined in the time it describes. That would have been strange, like someone in 2025 declaring, "Welcome to the age of regret and Wi-Fi." No, the phrase came later, much later. It was a Renaissance invention, whispered by scholars who believed they were bringing the world back into the light of ancient knowledge. To them, everything between Rome and their own era was a long night of intellectual sleepwalking, a bit dramatic and a little unfair. The Renaissance thinkers, like Petrarch and his friends, were eager to climb a ladder of their own making. To do that, they needed to step over something, and so the 1,000 years before them became ... the Dark Ages. It stuck, not because it was accurate, but because it was easy to remember, and history, like sleep, often remembers what is simplest, not what is truest. The empire fades but doesn't disappear when people speak of the fall of Rome. It sounds like a moment, a door slamming shut. But in truth, Rome didn't fall like a statue. It slouched like an old roof giving way over centuries. Even after the fall, cities still stood. Roads still connected towns. Markets still traded just with new taxes, new accents, new arrangements of who owed what to whom. People didn't stop farming wheat or carving stones because an emperor packed up his sandals. Life continued in smaller rhythms, just as it always does. Yes, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, but its eastern twin, the Byzantine Empire, carried on for another 1,000 years. And what's more, Roman law, language, and culture continued to echo in monastic halls, in dusty trade ledgers, in forgotten villages, where a grandmother still quoted Latin proverbs without remembering where they came from. So when we say the lights went out, we're ignoring the flickers that kept burning, small, maybe, but steady, quiet centers of memory. The monasteries of history were a nighttime landscape. Monasteries would be the glowing windows in the distance. After the fall of Rome, many cities fell into disrepair, and large-scale schools closed. But in the remote hills of Ireland, on the wind-blown cliffs of Northumbria, in forested valleys of Gaul, monks began to write, and they didn't stop in cold stone rooms. Hunched beneath dripping candles, they copied ancient texts, one painstaking letter at a time. They preserved Plato, Virgil, Galen, and the Gospel of Luke, all with the same quiet reverence. To a monk, writing was a form of devotion, and copying a sentence was not about speed, it was about perfection, contemplation, breath. They didn't just preserve religious texts, they also kept alive medicine, philosophy, astronomy, agriculture, and law. And when they ran out of parchment, they scraped older scrolls and wrote over them palimpsests, as their cold-layered memories of forgotten minds. Imagine a hand quivering in the cold, carefully, rewriting De Rerum Natura in Latin, while snow pressed against the window. That's not a world of darkness, that's a world of determination. The rise of quiet powers as Rome faded. New systems of governance rose, not through flashy revolutions, but through habit, tradition, and necessity. The early medieval world was not lawless. It simply followed different laws. Kings rose who were barely literate, but their scribes weren't. They documented taxes, harvests, disputes. Inheritance. In Frankish courts and Saxon villages, elders gathered to decide who owed whom what number of sheep. Their decisions were written, sometimes sung, passed down as both song and law. Feudalism wasn't chaos, it was hierarchy woven into obligation. A chain of handshakes and nods that held together communities without needing marble arches or bronze statues. It might look like disorganization to us, but it was order enough to feed people, protect them from raiders, and hold a village together long enough to build a church, or plant a vineyard, or teach a child the difference between rye and wheat. Darkness doesn't settle where routine survives. What we forgot to look forth trouble with calling an era dark is that it convinces us there's nothing to see. But in fact, we simply weren't looking in the right places. Historians used to believe science stopped in Europe during these centuries. Then they looked east to Baghdad, where scholars gathered in the House of Wisdom to translate Aristotle and experiment, with algebra to Cordoba in Islamic Spain, where gardens were irrigated by machines we only rediscovered centuries later, to Constantinople, where engineers maintained aqueducts, mosaics, and law codes copied from old Roman books. And even within the so-called Darklands, there were sparks. Carolingian script, the invention of musical notation, the beginnings of universities, not to mention women in convents who composed music, copied manuscripts, and treated the sick quietly, without fanfare. The silence of an era does not mean it is empty. It often means we weren't listening carefully enough. Darkness, reimagine Saul. What was the darkness, then? Perhaps it was the darkness of misunderstanding, of assuming that greatness must always wear togas or golden crowns. Perhaps it was a dimness caused not by the people of the time, but by those who came after, drawing thick curtains over centuries. They didn't understand, but in that shadowed room, people still lit candles. They still sang songs. They still planted, prayed, argued, invented, healed, and hoped. That's not darkness, that's life. And so we begin. This is only the beginning. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk slowly through those dark centuries and visit the quiet lives that continued within them. We'll spend time with monks who counted stars, with merchants who spoke 3 languages, but never left their harbor, with girls who wove history into fabric, and doctors who treated headaches with powdered roses. We'll look at what was lost, but more importantly, at what was kept, at what was passed on, quietly, without glory or recognition, like a whispered lullaby that someone remembered to hum even after forgetting the words. Tonight, you've heard only the opening lines, but there are many more candles to light, and many more small, gentle truths to warm your sleep. Let's return now to the quiet room where you left off. A candle still flickers on a wooden desk. Ink glistens in a shallow dish. And somewhere, in a place you've never been but somehow recognize, a monk is still writing. He's been there, all along, while wars came and went, while kings rose and fell, while cities collapsed and re-emerged. He just kept writing, and that perhaps more than anything else is what helped the world remember itself. The scriptorium, a room made of silence, Imagine walking through a cloister at dawn. The stone corridor is cool beneath your feet. Moss clings to the corners, the wind slips through the arches, carrying the scent of beeswax and old paper. Then you step into the scriptorium. This is no bustling library. It's a solemn chamber, built not for speaking, but for copying. Only the scratching of quills fills the air. Not hurried scribbles, slow strokes, measured and careful. Every letter must be right. There is no delete key here. You might think it's a gloomy place, but to the monks it was sacred. Copying words, especially sacred ones, was not just duty, it was a form of prayer. They weren't simply preserving knowledge, they were inhabiting it. Some of these monks were barely literate when they arrived. They learned their Latin one phrase at a time. Pax vobiscum. Peace be with you. A humble beginning, but over time their minds filled with memory. Not just scripture, but medical recipes, star charts, crop records, and ancient Roman speeches they might never understand, but knew were worth keeping. Ink, parchment, and patience, the tools, were simple, but nothing about the work was easy. First, parchment had to be made by stretching and scraping animal skin until it was thin, smooth, and pale like clouded glass. Each sheet could take days to prepare, and a single book might use the hides of 200 animals. Ink was boiled from oak galls or soot, then stored in walnut shells or clay pots. A quill had to be sharpened daily, sometimes hourly, and when copying a manuscript, there were no shortcuts, no skipping words, no casual glances at the source. You had to look, remember, write, then look again. Some scribes added flourishes at the end, finished on the feast of Saint Martin. May the reader not find too many errors. Others got cheeky. Here ends the book. Thanks be to God. And now my hand can rest. We often think of monks as humorless, but their margins tell another story. Marginalia, where the monks let loose the page, and what do you find? A goat playing a flute, a nun chasing a chicken, a bored-looking monk doodling a dragon with oddly tiny feet. These little drawings, called marginalia, weren't official, but they crept in any wake-quiet rebellions against monotony. Sometimes they illustrated the text. Sometimes they had absolutely nothing to do with it. Just a curious cat or a smiling snail with a spear. They remind us that these monks weren't machines. They got tired. They got silly. They stared at the same paragraph for hours and wondered why on earth Aristotle wrote so much. And so they doodled. In doing so, they left behind a trace of themselves, a fingerprint, a smile, a reminder that even in solemn silence, there was life. The knowledge they preserved it wasn't just scripture that filled these books. Monasteries preserved and recopied works by Galen, the Roman physician whose theories of humors shaped medicine for centuries. Boethius, whose consolation of philosophy offered quiet hope during imprisonment. Pliny the Elder, with his natural history, detailing animals, minerals, and curious facts like how to use hedgehogs to predict the weather. Aratus, who wrote poems about constellations, copied not because of astronomy, but because monks loved the way the stars sounded in Latin verse. They preserved farming manuals, calendars of moon phases, herbal guides, musical notation, and early grammars. Some copied in Greek, others in Latin, and some even in old Irish glosses, scribbled between the lines to help them understand the older language. Their work wasn't selective in the way a modern librarian might be. If it could be copied, it was. And in that indiscriminate copying, much was saved that would otherwise have disappeared. Irish monks and the far edge of the world, some of the most dedicated scribes, came from places we might now call remote, like the misty, green edges of Ireland. After the Roman Empire receded from Britain, Ireland was never conquered. In the same way, but rather than isolating it, this made Ireland a haven. Monks there, like St. Columba, founded abbeys that became centres of literacy and quiet learning. They sailed in coracles leather-bound, boats carrying books, not swords. They travelled to the Scottish Isles, to Gaul, to the edge of the known world, bringing texts, copying them, and founding more monasteries. The Irish didn't just preserve Roman learning, they gave it back centuries later. Scholars from France and Germany travelled to Iona, Lindisfarne, and Kells to find the knowledge they'd lost in their own homelands. From the edge of the map came the memory of a civilization, the Carolingian Renaissance, a flicker of lighting the 8th century. One ruler began to realize the power of books not as decoration, but as instruments of unity. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and soon to be Holy Roman Emperor, gathered scholars from across Europe and asked a simple question. Can we make sure everyone is reading the same version of the Bible? The answer was no, at least not yet. Because there were so many versions copied from copies of copies, that confusion reigned. So Charlemagne, with help from scholars like Alcuin of York, began what historians now call the Carolingian Renaissance, wave of standardized, corrected, and carefully scribed texts. They developed Carolingian, minuscule, a clear, consistent script, with spaces between words, a surprisingly new idea at the time. This made reading easier, which made learning easier, which made memory stronger. It was a flicker of light, not a bonfire, but steady, and still copied in the same cold rooms, by the same quiet hands. The books that outlived empires. When we look at these manuscripts today, it's easy to be dazzled by their beauty-gilded initials, painted saints, elaborate borders of ivy and ink. But the true miracle isn't how they look. It's that they exist at all. These books survived Viking raids, fires, moths, revolutions, and libraries that forgot they even had them. They outlived abbots and abbeys. They crossed oceans. They fell behind shelves and were rediscovered centuries later. They carry not just information, but intention. The intention of 1,000 anonymous monks who believed. Somehow that memory mattered. That copying a sentence could be a form of hope, and that even in the quietest places, even in the loneliest hours of the night, a single candle was worth keeping lit. And so we keep reading. Tonight, you've followed the ink trail through stone walls and flickering light. You've watched a monk smile at a margin. You've touched a parchment page without tearing it. You've walked through time without rushing. There are more stories ahead of midwives and astronomers, of herbalists and builders, of travelers who never left their village. They didn't make headlines, but they held the line. The world didn't stop remembering. It just whispered for a while. You're still with us, still lying quietly, still listening with one ear to the hum of history. The candle hasn't gone out yet. In fact, its glow is spreading. From monastic scriptoria to open-air workshops, from stone courtyards to clay-filled kilns. Tonight, we leave behind the parchment and the quill. Tonight, we walk among stones. Because even as the empires crumbled and books were quietly copied in abbeys, another kind of preservation took place. A practical, unthinking kind. Not in words but in walls. Not in scrolls but in stones. And the people who preserved them didn't even know they were doing it. They just needed shelter. Floors, roofs, doors, bread ovens. And as they built, they borrowed. And as they borrowed, they remembered without trying to. Let's go see what they built. The bones of Rome after the Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 CE. No trumpets sounded. No marble cracked purely from sadness. The buildings didn't vanish. The aqueducts still stood. The roads still stretched straight across the landscape, like threads on an unfinished loom. And what's more, they still worked. A medieval peasant might not have spoken Latin, but they could recognize a good stone wall when they saw one. When they needed to build a house or a bakery or a church, they didn't quarry fresh marble from a distant hill. They just walked to the ruins and took what they needed. Spolia, Rome. Rearranged, there's a name for this practice. Spolia. It comes from the Latin for spoils, as in spoils of war or inheritance. But here, it refers to the reuse of earlier building materials in new constructions. That doorway in a medieval church, it might once have framed a Roman bath. That pillar in a dusty courtyard, a retired member of a Roman forum. That cobbled road beneath your feet, still echoing the sandals of long-dead senators. This wasn't just recycling, it was layering, and like a palimpsest of stone. These buildings kept the old world intact, just beneath the surface. Builders who didn't call themselves architects and like Roman engineers. Most builders in the early medieval world didn't sign their work. They didn't draft formal blueprints. They worked from memory, mentorship, and observation. A boy who helped his uncle repair an arch would learn how pressure moved through stone long before he could write his name. A mason might know the perfect mix of lime and sand by smell alone. They weren't trying to honor Rome. They just knew that Roman stuff didn't fall down. That was enough. And so, city by city, hilltop by hilltop, the bones of the empire were sewn into the new patchwork of medieval Europe. Churches and the geometry of sleepwalk. Into a Romanesque church built in the 11th century, and you might feel like you've stepped into a time machine. The thick columns, the barrel vaults, the coffered ceilings. It all feels ... familiar. Because it is, even though the builders didn't have Vitruvius open on the workbench. They inherited his rules through stone and habit. They copied what lasted, and they avoided what cracked. In this way, Roman engineering slipped into medieval hands through practice instead of parchment. Many of the great cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Canterbury stand on Roman foundations. Literally, they were built on top of old forums, temples, and roads. Their stone was sometimes stolen, sometimes sanctified, sometimes just ... available. And as the stained glass rose and bells began to toll, few looked down to wonder whose floor they were standing on. But the floor remembered, the Islamic world. A new geometry emerges while medieval Europe slowly reimagined old Roman forms. The Islamic world created entirely new ones, and yet even Roman influence drifted like a hidden thread in places like Cordoba, Damascus, and Baghdad. Builders took what they found: columns, mosaics, arches, and turned them into something radiant and new. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, for instance, contains hundreds of columns, many of them Roman or Visigothic, but their repetition, their rhythm, their heighties were innovations. Islamic architects didn't just reuse Roman parts, they abstracted them. They saw the geometry beneath the marble, and from that geometry, They created forms of visual poetry, interlacing arabesques, endless domes, honeycomb vaults that seemed to float. They honored the structure, not the symbol, and in doing so, they preserved classical ideas without worshipping classical forms. Builders without blueprints in the modern world. Buildings are born from paper, sketches, drafts, structural calculations, but for many centuries, structures rose from muscle and memory. Builders might carve a shape into a piece of wood to remember it, or draw lines in the dust with a stick, or use nothing but ropes and stakes to map out the arc of an arch. A medieval church builder might never read, but they could balance the weight of 50 tons of stone across a perfect curve. And when they died, their knowledge passed to an apprentice not in a lecture hall, but in the hush of scaffolding at dawn. They didn't preserve the Roman world with scrolls. They preserved it with hands. Lost cities that were never truly lost. Some Roman cities were buried by sand, soil, or silence, but even the buried ones left hints. In places like Pompeii, rediscovered centuries later, we find streets, graffiti, loaves of bread still carbonized in ovens. In Constantinople, engineers maintained aqueducts first laid by Roman workers hundreds of years earlier, and in tiny medieval villages, walls were built upon older walls, and wells still used stones once touched by Roman hands. Archaeologists dig through time not in layers of culture, but in layers of practicality. The past wasn't hidden, it was used, then used again. Memory that was never written down. When we think of preservation, we often think of texts. But there is also the preservation of rhythm, of technique, of instinct. A mason who felt where to place a keystone, a carpenter who knew which would warp in the rain, a baker who used a Roman millstone without knowing what SPQR meant. This kind of knowledge doesn't come with citations, it comes with doing, and it's often the kind that endures longest, because it's not stored in libraries. It's stored in hands, the builders who dreamed in stone toward the late medieval period. As towns began to grow and trade returned, builders started pushing the limits again. Gothic arches soared higher, flying buttresses flung weight away like wings. Rose windows bloomed in stone, but they didn't throw away the past. They built on it, literally and figuratively. Many Gothic architects were trained as masons. They spent decades watching how structures held or cracked. They didn't know Roman theory, but they lived Roman proof. And sometimes that's stronger than knowledge. A building that stands for 500 years doesn't need a footnote. It needs a door that doesn't stick in the rain. And so the cities lingered. As you drift now towards sleep, picture a city that never quite fell. Its buildings changed hands. Its stones were turned. Its pillars were reused. But its shape remained. A city of layers. A city of habit. A city where one child watched a tower rise, and another played among its ruins, and another carved a window into its side. The builders didn't write manifestos, but they remembered where the sun landed each morning. They remembered how arches leaned, and they remembered how to stack one good stone on another. That's how memory survives, even in the dark, not always in books, sometimes in bricks. The empire had vanished, the senators were gone, the marble halls had cracked, but somewhere, in a small field behind a wooden fence, someone was growing onions, and just a few hills away, another someone was pressing oil from olives, brushing flies away with a bundle of dried lavender. That's the part we often forget. When Rome collapsed in the West, people still needed breakfast. They still needed lentils, barley, bread, cheese, Honey if the bees cooperated, mushrooms if they knew where to look, wild berries if they were lucky, and salt always salt. History doesn't stop eating, even in the dark dot. So tonight, we step off the cobbled roads and into the garden's quiet ones. Something very old was being slowly and sleepily remade. Fields, without emperors after the Roman administrators left, much of their fancy farming bureaucracy fell apart. No more centralized grain taxes, no more imperial quotas, no more Latin land, surveys conducted with rods and scrolls. But the soil stayed, and people still knew what it liked, what grew best on the sunlit hills, what should be planted after the rains, when to sow peas, when to wait, when to kneel and hope. Farming didn't collapse. It just shrank down to households, monasteries, small villages. The grand villas of Roman estates sometimes crumbled, but the land around them, it was too precious to ignore. Families moved in, reclaimed the orchards, turned tiled courtyards into vegetable beds. Rome had ruled through structure, but farming was ruled by rhythm, and rhythms are hard to erase. The monks who grew quiet kingdoms in many places, especially after the 6th century, monasteries became hubs of practical agriculture. Not just prayer but plows, monastic rules like those of St. Benedictric, physical labor as part of devotion, and farming became the preferred form. Quiet, predictable, close to nature. Monks studied weather, rotated crops, tended orchards, grafted vines. They kept bees and brewed ale. They dried herbs and boiled jams. In a world without supermarkets, a monastery was a storehouse, a seed bank, and a test kitchen rolled into one. Some even kept experimental gardens, one plot for known crops, another for strange new arrivals: fava beans, sorrel, garlic from the east. And when pilgrims passed through, they carried those seeds onward in little pouches tied to their belts. Knowledge traveled quietly, what the earth still offered, though some Roman crops faded from common use. Many staples endured. Fields still grew. Wheat, ground by hand or water wheel, then baked into coarse bread barley for beer, and porridge lentils and beans. The peasants, proteins cabbage and onions, reliable, hearty and good for stews. And beets easy to grow, easier to forget grapes. Not just for wine, but dried for sweetening. The Mediterranean never lost its olives. Northern forests still gave hazelnuts and wild herbs. Even forgotten Roman luxuries like garum, fermented fish sauce, were replaced with saltier, simpler condiments. And then there were the kitchen gardens, close to the hearth, often tended by women. These gardens kept households alive: parsley, sage, leeks, chives, rue for headaches, mint for digestion, chamomile for sleep. The medicine chest was green, and it grew outside your door. Tools made of memory. Many farming tools remained unchanged from Roman days. The ard, a simple scratch plough, was still dragged behind oxen. Hoes were still wood-handled. Sickles still gleamed in the fields like tiny crescent moons. Iron was reused. Old Roman nails and blades were reshaped into new tools. When you couldn't buy what you needed, you shaped it from what remained. The tools didn't carry names like Rome or Empire. They just carried calluses. You learned to sharpen a scythe, not from a scroll but from your grandfather. And if your scythe broke, you kept the handle, because handles, like memories, are always harder to replace than the sharp part. Kitchens of clay and smokes step into a medieval kitchen. Just before supper, and you'll find simplicity stitched together with ash and thyme. A fire crackles low in the hearth. A pot hangs over it by a curved iron hook. There are no glass jars or copper. Pans, just earthenware bowls and blackened wood spoons. Flatbread dough rests in a corner. Cheese curdles quietly beneath a cloth. Dried beans wait their turn. The air smells of garlic and smoke. Children sit near the warmth, shelling peas or threading dried apples on string. A cat yawns by the door, nothing extravagant, but it's full of care. And in a time when illness, war, or poor weather could turn meals uncertain, that care meant everything. Recipes with no books there. Were no cookbooks for most of the early medieval period, not because people didn't cook, but because everyone cooked. It was assumed knowledge. You learned by watching, measuring with your palm, judging heat by the crackle, timing bread by feel. A recipe might go like this: take the good flour, mix until it no longer sticks to your knuckles, bake until the wood smoke smells right. Not precise, but it worked. And because these methods were passed down in whispers and gestures, not ink and parchment, they changed little, even as centuries passed. In this way, culinary memory survived where academic memory often failed. You might forget the name of the emperor, but never how to make lentil stew. Hungry seasons, quiet ingenuity farming wasn't always fruitful. There were bad years, too much rain, not enough. Sun, pestilence, rust, frost that came too soon. But people adapted. They learned to dry and salt meat. They stored grain in clay pots, honey in beeswax-sealed jars, apples in cold straw under beds. Some built root cellars. Others buried cabbages in barrels of sand. Every region had its tricks, and none of them came from books. They came from mothers, and neighbors, and the silent teacher of a difficult winter. Survival didn't look like glory. It looked like mold-free bread in February, feasting. Even the poor feasted when they could, not with gold or abundance, but with shared joy, a fattened goose saved for midwinter, a wheel of cheese cracked open on a saint's day, honeyed cakes made only once a year, and music. Always. Music, fiddles scraped, voices lifted. Someone banged a spoon against a jug. These moments didn't show up in historical records, but they were recorded in memories, in laughter, in toasts, in the shared relief of a harvest safely stored. Even in dark years, the fire was fed. Seeds that crossed time. Much of the food we now associate with Europe, tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, maize hadn't arrived yet. But within the medieval diet were seeds that endured. Carrots, rye, barley, onions, apples, leeks, garlic, foods that still fill our kitchens. Their shapes have changed. Their flavors have evolved, but they are, at heart, survivors, just like the people who kept them growing, one careful planting at a time. So let the garden sleep as you drift further now into your own soft field of sleep. Know this, the world did not starve when the emperors left. It did not forget how to grow. It just turned inward. Villages grew where villas once stood. Beats replaced banquets, and memory found root in soil, not scroll. The darkness of the era wasn't hunger, it was humility. 1,000 nameless hands keeping the world fed, quietly, while history forgot their names. But the bread still rose, and the gardens still grew. You might think history was carried on the backs of kings or written with the swords of warriors. But tonight, we turn instead to the soft scrape of a spindle, the hush of thread through linen, the warmth of a cloak passed from mother to daughter. History, has always been held together by small things, stitches, whispers, warm bread, lullabies, and cloth. So as we move further into the so-called Dark Ages, we step not into battlefields or crumbling palaces, but into homes, into weaving huts, kitchens, cloisters, and courtyards, where women worked not with glory, but with quiet necessity. And by doing so, they kept communities from unraveling. Threads in the shadows, the records are sparse. That's the first thing you'll notice when you go looking for women in early medieval sources. There are queens and saints, yes, the occasional noblewoman whose dowry was large enough to warrant a paragraph in a monk's chronicle. But most women lived beyond parchment. They spun wool while feeding children. They mended clothes by candlelight. They harvested herbs. They hauled water, and they did it all without expecting anyone to write it down. But just because the scribes weren't watching doesn't mean the threads weren't there. In fact, the world would have unraveled without them. The spindle and the hearth. Let's start at the hearth. This was the heart of most households, all, urban, rich, or poor. It warmed the soup and dried the socks. It cooked the flatbread and boiled the dye pots. It was where children huddled in winter, and where stories were told, and near it, always, was the spindle. Wool didn't come in neat balls. It came in dirty clumps, shorn from sheep, tangled with burrs and lanolin. Women cleaned it, combed it, carded it, then spun it, twisting and pulling the fibers into thread. This thread was used for weaving, for mending, for sewing, for nets, ropes, bandages, bindings, and baby clothes. It clothed entire families, and yet it was often made while walking, while talking, while rocking a cradle with a foot. Spinning wasn't a task, it was a rhythm, a background hum to daily life, and it stitched generations together, weaving in the women's hallan. Many Northern European cultures, especially Anglo-Saxon and Norse, society's wealthier women presided over the weaving hall. This wasn't a dainty room, it was a clattering, dusty, muscular place. Warp-weighted looms stood tall against the wall. Heavy stones held the threads taut. The women wove upright, pulling yarns through with calloused fingers. A single blanket might take weeks to make, a sail for a ship, months, and make no mistake, these sails weren't decorations. They powered Viking longships across oceans. The fate of raids, trades, and explorations depended on fabric made by women far from the waves. To weave, then, was to move the world. If no one said so out loud, herbalists, midwives, and keepers of small knowledge beyond the loom, women, held a different kind of wisdom, herbal and bodily knowledge. They gathered yarrow for bleeding, mugwort for cramps, chamomile for colic, sage for sore throats, nettles for strength. Most of this knowledge wasn't written. It was sung, whispered, practiced, passed from old to young through daily use. The same hands that stirred soup also mixed salves. The same lips that sang lullabies also recited prayers over poultices. And when childbirth came, it was women who helped women. The midwife was not just a healer. She was also a spiritual presence. She knew how to fold the sheets, how to time the breaths, how to speak comfort into the trembling air. Many of these women were never named, but without them, entire villages would not have survived the winter. Women in monastic life. Some women found their path not in marriage or motherhood, but in cloisters. Monastic life offered a rare kind of freedom, time to think, read, pray, and write. Places like Whitby Abbey, founded by St. Hilda in 7th century England, became centers of learning and peace. Nuns copied manuscripts, tended gardens, cared for the sick. Some even composed poetry and music. Their letters, when preserved, show clear minds and firm leadership. But even here, they spun, they sewed, they mended, because a cloister too needed clothing and candles and clean sheets. The sacred and the domestic were never far apart. Cloth as currency in the early medieval economy. Money was scarce, but cloth, especially well-made cloth, was as good as coin. A bolt of linen could pay a debt. A finely woven woolen cloak might be part of a dowry. Embroidered garments were offered to churches as gifts. Even kings accepted tunics and veils in tribute. This made women's work central to the economy, even if it wasn't counted in ledgers. In some areas, taxes could be paid in cloth, and a skilled weaver was more valuable to a village than a knight, even when anonymous. Their hands left marks everywhere. Embroidery as memory. Some cloth was more than functional. It was story. Take the famous Bayeux tapestry, embroidered by women. In the 11th century, nearly 70 meters long, it tells the story of the Norman conquest not in Latin, but in thread. Scenes of battles, banquets, omens, ships all stitched in quiet, deliberate rhythm. And while the names of the women who embroidered it are lost, their art speaks louder than any chronicle. Their stitches are precise, their borders playful. They tucked in strange creatures, lions, owls, even mythical beasts beside the soldiers and swords. Because even in history's most dramatic moments, someone still has to thread the needle, holding the family map without public records. It was often the women who remembered who was born when, who married whom, who had land, who had debts. They were the keepers of memory, human family trees, unwritten ledgers of the living and the dead. And they didn't forget. They passed it down in the form of stories told at the fireside, names recited while braiding hair, dates remembered through feast days and saints' calendars. The woman who remembered the family map wasn't just a grandmother, she was an archivist, and her stories were as binding as any seal. Small things, great strength. We often look for power in grand moments, but in the Dark Ages, power often wore an apron or a shawl or bare feet. It boiled water, wrapped wounds, sewed buttons, told bedtime stories in lean years. Women didn't need to conquer kingdoms to shape the world. They just needed to keep the candles burning, to pass on knowledge in quiet ways, to stitch and sew and speak softly, and by doing so, they wove a net strong enough to carry history through its darkest nights. So rest. With the weavers, now you can almost hear it, the quiet creak of a loom, the hum of an old spinning song. You can almost feel the thread, soft and strong between thumb and finger. Tonight, you lie wrapped in centuries of cloth woven, mended, remembered by women who were never famous, but always essential. Sleep well. They made sure you could. You are lying still now. Let the shadows stretch long across the wooden beams of an old hall. Let the fire crackle low. Imagine a circle of people, quiet, listening, waiting not for a king or a judge, but for a man with no robe, no gavel, no parchment. Just memory. Because tonight we enter a world of law without lawyers, justice without jails, rules without rule books, a place where law slept inside the heads of the oldest men in the village and was spoken softly, like a story passed from grandfather to grandson. This was the justice of the early medieval world. And though it may seem strange now, It was no less binding than what we print in books today. So settle in. We are entering the hush of custom, the weight of reputation, the law of the whisper. Laws without letters after the fall of Rome, written law codes grew scarce. In the western countryside, yes, kings and bishops occasionally issued decrees. Some scribes still copied fragments of Roman law, but for most people, peasants, farmers, villagers' law wasn't read. It was remembered and spoken, sometimes chanted, sometimes recited, always delivered by men whose heads held generations of agreements, feuds, fines, and settlements. They were the law speakers, or wise men. They didn't carry scrolls. They didn't sit behind desks. They stood at the center of gatherings and spoke aloud the decisions that kept villages from unraveling. The law lived in breath and bone, not in ink. The thing where justice gathered in much of early medieval Europe, especially the Germanic and Norse regions. Justice was administered through gatherings called things. Yes, just thing. From the Old Norse wing, a thing wasn't a courtroom. It was more like an open-air parliament, held on a field or hill. Free men gathered, often yearly or seasonally, to settle disputes and confirm rules. Arguments were aired, fines were assigned, oaths were sworn. Sometimes sheep changed hands, sometimes land, sometimes bitter words. The law wasn't shouted down. From above, it was built through consensus, and the decisions made were binding not because a king said so, but because everyone heard it together. Oaths stronger than Loxin. A world without police forces or surveillance. How did anyone know the law would be obeyed? The answer, the oath. Swearing an oath before the community was not taken lightly. To break it meant not only divine punishment, it meant losing honor. And honor was more valuable than coin. To swear falsely meant being untrusted, unwelcome sometimes. Outlawed, entirely forced to leave your home, denied hospitality, cast into silence. Some oaths were sworn on relics, some on swords. Some required elaborate rituals, standing barefoot, holding iron, or weeping publicly. Truth was not proven through evidence. It was measured in how well you remembered the words, and how many people trusted your voice. Compensation. Not revenge. Many early medieval laws focus not on punishment but compensation. If someone stole a pig, they owed you a pig. If someone broke your fence, they repaired it. If someone injured you, they paid a fine according to your rank, your role, your injury. These fines were called wergeld man, price in Anglo-Saxon England. Each person had a set value. A noble's life cost more than a serf's, but everyone had a value, and this oddly gave protection. It turned vengeance into transaction, instead of a cycle of retaliation. The village sought balance. A life taken meant a family fed. A hand injured meant a debt of grain. It wasn't always fair, but it was meant to stop the bleeding, and it often worked. Women and the quiet law. Women's roles in early law were complex. They rarely served as judges or law speakers, but they had rights, especially regarding marriage, property, and protection. A woman could own land in some areas. She could inherit. She could testify, especially in matters of family, oaths, or ritual. And if a woman was wronged, her kin could demand compensation. In Icelandic sagas, women's voices often spark legal actions. A wife pushes her husband to avenge an insult. A widow demands her inheritance. A sister reminds her brother of an unpaid debt. Their voices weren't loud, but they were powerful. Justice often moved because a woman remembered. Law inside the cloister in monasteries and bishoprics. The legal world looked different. Here, canon, law held swearels set by the church, written in Latin, preserved by scholars. But even these rules had to be lived. Monks debated penance. How many prayers should be said for stealing a chicken? Should a monk who fell asleep during evening prayer be punished or pitied? The penitentials books listing sins and their punishments read like sleepy shopping lists. If a man eats before sunset during Lent, 20 lashes or 30 psalms. If a monk laughs during matins, 7 days of silence. These laws didn't always match village life, but they show a world trying to draw lines, soft lines, drawn in chalk and candlelight. Justice in the absence of judges if no one wrote down the rules, and number one wore a wig and robe. How did people feel justice was done? Often it came down to reputation, memory, consensus, public performance. Justice was performed in front of others. On feast days, under the open sky, the village saw the oath sworn. They watched the fine handed over. They listened to the apology. This visibility made the system work. You didn't fear the king, you feared your neighbor remembering. Trials by ordeals sometimes. Justice took more theatrical forms when truth couldn't be decided. People turned to ordeals tests, thought to reveal divine judgment. Hot iron, a person carried a red-hot rod. If their wound healed cleanly, they were innocent. Cold water, the accused was dropped into a stream. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the pure water. Holy bread, a priest or accused person swallowed bread after an oath. If they choked, they had lied. Strange. Yes, but to early medieval people, these ordeals weren't superstition. They were ways to let the divine speak when human voices failed, and, surprisingly, ordeals were often staged to allow mercy. The iron might not be too hot, the water not too deep. Justice had theatre, but it also had a heart. Law in the margins. Some laws protected the forest, some covered roads, some regulated markets, many protected hospitality. To harm a guest in your home was a grave offense. To deny shelter to a traveler was frowned upon. To break bread and then break trust was a social wound deeper than theft. Hospitality was sacred, and so much of early law lived in the space between homes, in thresholds, courtyards, inns, firesides. Justice happened not in courts, but in shared spaces, in places where everyone listened, and no one wrote it down. So, sleep beneath the law, let the fire die low. Now let the circle of voices quiet. Let the law fall silent, because it's lost, but because it's remembered. The law of the early medieval world was not a hammer. It was a hush, a balance, a hand held out with a debt of grain and a hope for peace. Justice, like sleep, arrived when the village stopped arguing and started listening. The Roman schools had closed. The libraries stood silent, their scrolls curling in the damp. Ink pots were tipped, scribes dismissed, statues buried or shattered. And yet knowledge did not vanish. It didn't vanish because it had nowhere else to go. It simply hid. Tonight, we follow that knowledge not in grand universities or golden academies, but in narrow cloisters, smoky scriptoria, dusty satchels carried by traveling monks. We walk not through bright marble lecture halls, but over cold stone corridors, where someone is still writing very slowly by candlelight. In the great silence that followed the fall of Rome, the pen still moved. The ink never dried. The end of Roman education. Let's begin with the myth that when Rome fell in the West, education collapsed entirely, that books were burned, thinkers scattered, and writing itself forgot how to spell. But the truth is more muted. Yes, formal schools especially, in cities, without imperial funding and civic infrastructure, the grand grammar schools and rhetoric academies disappeared. But local learning didn't vanish overnight. In some regions, particularly in Italy and Gaul, bishops and monasteries preserved small centers of study. Children still learned Latin, though fewer of them. Some families passed books from hand to hand like precious heirlooms and far from the cities. In Ireland, a different miracle began. Ireland, the island of Scribblers' Ireland, untouched by Roman conquest, became a surprising sanctuary for learning. From the 5th century onward, Irish monks began collecting, copying, and even reinterpreting ancient texts. They translated the Gospels. They preserved Latin grammar. They created poetic glosses, tiny poems scribbled into the margins of sacred texts. They also wrote about stars, animals, plants, and weather. Many monasteries doubled as scriptoria writing workshops, where monks copied manuscripts, line by painstaking line, their script. Neat, rounded, careful, what we now call insular script, their ink made from soot, oak galls, and wine. Their parchment, calfskin, scraped and stretched by hand. Their lighting, a single flame. It was not efficient, but it was enduring. The beauty of boredom illuminated manuscripts. Some monks didn't stop at copying. They illuminated, in the margins of sacred texts. They painted spirals, beasts, angels, and cats. They decorated capital letters with gold leaf. They doodled warriors and rabbits and dragons curled around the words of God. Take the Book of Kells, created around the year 800. Each page is a careful storm of color and symmetry. Some letters are so intricate they could take a full day to complete. These illuminations weren't just for decoration. They were meditations, way to pray with brush and ink, to linger on each word like it mattered. Because in this world, every letter did traveling texts. How knowledge moved by footbooks were rare and heavy. So how did knowledge spread? It walked. Monks traveled from monastery to monastery, often barefoot, carrying texts wrapped in cloth. A book might be lent for a winter, then copied, then passed on. Monasteries in Gaul, Britain, and the Germanic lands began receiving Irish texts, and in return sent fragments of Roman learning. It was slow, but like a candle lighting another, it spread by the 8th century. Alcuin of York, an English monk, had brought these traditions to the court of Charlemagne, sparking a brief renaissance of learning. All of this because the ink kept moving. The Carolingian, minuscule, small letters. Big impact. Alcuin and his fellow scholars introduced something quietly revolutionary. Carolingian, minuscule. Before this, Latin manuscripts were written in sprawling, hard-to-read capital letters. But the Carolingian script, neat, rounded, evenly spaced, was legible, consistent, and faster to copy. It became the foundation for modern, lowercase handwriting. And thanks to this clarity, hundreds of classical texts were recopied and preserved. Works by Virgil, Cicero, Augustin, rinked by scribes who might never read them aloud, but understood their importance. You could say these small letters saved big ideas, and they did it without fanfare. Just scribes at desks, scratching. By candlelight. Women of the quill knot. All scribes were men in some convents. Women were trained in reading and writing, especially noble women who entered religious life. Some copied psalters, others composed prayers, translated scripture, even composed histories. One of the most famous was Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century. Yes, But born of this slow tradition, she wrote about medicine, theology, music, and visions. Her books contain drawings of the cosmos, cures made from fennel, and haunting hymns. But even unnamed nuns made their mark. In 2019, scientists discovered flecks of lapis lazuli, blue pigment in the teeth of a medieval woman's remains. In Germany, she had likely been illuminating manuscripts. She chewed the brush to shape the bristles. History remembers the ink, but sometimes it forgets the woman who licked the brush. Knowledge in the margins weren't empty. They were playgrounds. Monks scribbled jokes, drew animals, left little prayers. One Irish monk even jotted a poem about his cat, Pangaban, who chased mice while the scribe chased wisdom. I and Pangaban, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at ... Knowledge wasn't dry or formal. It was human. It purred. It smiled. It stumbled and rhymed. These margins are what kept knowledge warm. What was, preserved, and what was not, everything survived. Much classical science was lost in Europe but preserved in the Islamic world, where scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. Names like Galen, Aristotle, and Ptolemy were saved by scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, and some ideas disappeared for centuries: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy only, to return later through translation, trade, and rediscovery. But the Christian monasteries kept what they could: moral tales, medical advice, calendars, psalms, histories, even cooking instructions, lists of herbs, weather proverbs. What was saved was what was used, and that, too, tells us something. The ink still glows. Many of these manuscripts survive. Some are cracked. Some are faded. Some have mouse bites along the edges. But the ink still glows faintly under soft light. It's not just information, it's care. Every letter shaped by hand. Every error corrected in the margin with a tiny or scribble. There is something sleepy about it. Something human, as though the scribe paused mid-word to scratch his nose, sip something warm, glance out the window at snow, and then return to the page with steady patience. That rhythm, you can still feel it. So close the codex now, let the candle flicker low, let the ink dry just for a while. The page has been copied. The letters are safe. The words preserved, not because of conquest, but because of kindness. Because someone, long ago, believed that even in darkness, learning mattered. And so tonight, you rest wrapped in the quiet breath of books, the hum of ink, the glow of a script that never slept. Sleep, scribe. The knowledge is safe. Forget the empire. Forget marble arches, aqueducts, Latin inscriptions, silver coins stamped with eagles. Because tonight, we walk into a village where no one remembers any of that. Not because they are simple or foolish, but because Rome never mattered here. This village does not know the names of emperors, but it knows when the swallows return. It knows when to plant onions. It knows which wind brings hail and which brings warmth. It knows that when the moon is full, the wolves stay away from the lambs. Here, in a corner of early medieval Europe, or perhaps in the wooded edges of old Gaul or the high meadows of the Alps, the villagers have forgotten the empire, have remembered everything that actually matters. What happens after collapse? When great civilizations fall, the sound is often quieter than you'd think. No trumpet, no thunderclap, just one tax collector not showing up, one roof unrepaired, one road turning to dust after Rome's hold loosened. Many regions simply kept going, but differently. Towns shrank, villas crumbled, coins vanished, markets turned local, and in the countryside, far from politics, people returned to older rhythms, older wisdom. They no longer sent grain to the capital, they sent it to the baker down the lane, and instead of writing letters in Latin, they sang songs about the weather. The calendar of the soil. Imagine waking up and not knowing the date. No calendar, no Monday, no 476 CE, but you still know it's ploughing time, or lambing season, or that week when the birch trees whisper before the frost. This is the agricultural calendar. It is not written on paper, but remembered in bones, knees, smells, bird calls. The Dark Age villager doesn't track months. They track moments. When the elderflower blooms, the bees are ready. When the frogs croak at dusk, the rain comes tomorrow. When your shadow is shortest at mid-meal, it's midsummer. This is not ignorance. This is lived precision. Tools of the forgotten. The villagers don't have Roman plows. They have wooden scratch plows passed down from grandfathers. They don't have bricks. They have wattle and doorballs made of woven twigs and mud. They don't forge coins. They trade eggs for linen, bread for soap, a repaired boot for a spoonful of salt. And yet, the village runs on logic. The tools are old but functional. The ovens are shared. The water is carried from the stream at the same hour each day, and the people, tired, sun-browned, alert, because if they don't remember the empire, they remember how to survive without one. Houses made of memory. Step into a house. Duck your head. There's no marble, no tile, no glass, just packed earth floors, smoked timbers, a fire burning low in the center. The walls tell stories. One beam was cut from your grandmother's fallen roof. The hearthstone came from the stringed basket. Hooks were once nails in a Roman barn. Nothing is wasted. Everything is remembered. The house grows as you grow an extra lean-to here, a thatch repair there. It's not much, but it's warm. And it listens. Oral maps and invisible borders ask. 4 directions in this village, and no one mentions miles. They say, past the rock that hums in spring, or where the foxes cross the path at dusk, or turn left where the wind smells like apples. These are oral maps deeply embedded in local memory. They work better than compasses, because they're alive. They shift with the land. They rely on attention, not signs, when travelers arrive. They're met not with hostility, but curiosity and stew. Even strangers remember something, a song, a proverb, a name. Everyone is foreign, and everyone is kin. What they did know. This village may have forgotten how to write, but it remembers how to brew beer without hops, how to treat a fever with mint and willow bark, how to find north using ants and stones, how to sing 4 verses of a lullaby that helps colicky babies sleep, how to knit socks with 5 sticks and no pattern. This is a world built not on conquest, but on competence, not on parchment, but practice. The moon and the manja religion comes. Softly the old gods still live in the corners, a whisper at the well, a ribbon on the elder tree. But now the village priest tells stories of saints, not emperors or bishops, but barefoot saints, shepherd saints, saints who liked bees. The villagers nod. That makes sense. They don't build cathedrals. They build shrines from driftwood and candles from sheep tallow. They carve crosses into doorposts, not to impress, but to protect. They don't debate theology. They hum prayers while kneading bread. When the sky is the only book most villagers cannot read. But they don't need books to understand patterns. They read the sky. They know when the stars disappear behind certain clouds, it's going to snow. They know the halo around the moon means frost. They know which birds leave first, and which stay through hunger. Their astronomy is not abstract, it's woven into chores. And the children grow up knowing the stars by where the goats sleep beneath them. Knowledge that doesn't look like knowledge to the historian. This village might seem illiterate, unaware, lost in time, but that's only if you think. Knowledge has to look like parchment and quills. Here, knowledge is in hands. How to twist straw into rope, how to spot bad mushrooms, how to feel a horse's hooves and know it will snow here. Knowing is not for tests. It's for tomorrow morning, and it is tested every day, not by examiners, but by frost, fire, illness, and birth. And the village passes every year it survives. So sleep beneath the thatched roof, the fire has gone down now. The goats are quiet. Outside the frost is thin on the windowsill. Inside, someone is telling a story you've heard 100 times about the fox who outsmarted the priest, or the boy who married a fish. You do's. You know how the story ends, and it's never written down. The village will forget the name of Caesar, but it will remember how to keep you warm. Sleep now. Someone already brought in the firewood. Someone remembered how to mend the roof. The empire is gone, but the rain is still coming, and the people here know what to do. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath deepen. Let your toes warm beneath imaginary woolen socks. Tonight, we enter a world where nothing was fast. Everything was hand-stitched, and comfort wasn't a luxury, it was survival, because the people of the so-called Dark Ages may have lacked electricity and printing presses, but they invented cozy, not out of aesthetic preference, but out of deep human need, to survive winters, to soften daily labor, to feel, even in a harsh world, the small relief of warmth. This is not a story of castles and battles. It is a story of blankets, bread, firelight, and the quiet genius of getting comfortable. A world without central heating, there are no radiators. In this world, no heated floors, no electric kettles. And yet, somehow, people stayed warm. Because warmth wasn't just heat, it was a system. Firewood was gathered months ahead. Thatch was thick. Hearths were always lit. Sleeping areas were arranged around the center flame, with animals often nearby, not just for company, but for warmth. A pig in the corner might mean the difference between frostbite and a good night's sleep, and no one slept alone unless they had to, because body heat is better than any blanket. The architecture of age homes weren't designed for grandeur. They were designed for retention. Low ceilings kept the heat close. Small doors minimized drafts. Walls were packed with straw or mud. Floors were often dirt, but layered with hay, rushes, or even worn-out fabric for insulation. Chimneys, rare. Instead, smoke curled up through a hole in the roof, giving the air a thick, sleepy scent. A family might live, cook, sleep, and craft all in a single warm room. Not glamorous, but deeply efficient, and undeniably cozy. The glow of the hearth at the center of all things, the hearth. It wasn't just for cooking, it was a place for gathering, storytelling, mending, praying, thinking, napping. The flicker of firelight made hard days feel gentler. The shadows on the walls gave the imagination something to play with in many villages. It was said, when the fire dies, the house dies. Children learned early how to keep embers banked with ash overnight, ready to be rekindled come dawn. Because No fire in the morning meant cold porridge and stiffer joints. The hearth was not just a convenience. It was the heartbeat of the home. Wool was wealth in a world where every sheep mattered. Wool was gold, and so people learned to spin it with care, weave it with rhythm and wear it in layers. Tunics, cloaks, mittens, hoods, blankets, all handmade, all essential. Some wool was scratchy, some was soft. All of it was worn until threadbare. Even the poorest homes had a spindle, and carding combs tucked by the fire, and some nights were spent not in song or prayer, but in the rhythmic hush-hush of spinning, turning sheep's winter coats into human. One's bed was a verb. You didn't have a bed. You made one each night. Straw was fluffed, blankets rearranged, warm stones slipped under cloth, children tucked in like bundles of bread dough. Some families slept side by side on benches or shared pallets head to toe. Others unrolled mats. Privacy wasn't the goal. Warmth was. A fur-lined sleeping hood, a woolen wrap around the toes, and maybe a cat curled at your side. This was the medieval version of luxury bedding, and if you woke in the night, you added wood to the fire and stirred the stew, because sleeping, like living, was a group effort. Cozy by necessity. To be comfortable in the Dark Ages meant making peace with slowness. A stew took hours, bread took days, laundry took forever, so you settled into the rhythm. People sang while kneading, hummed while darning, told stories while stirring pots. They worked while sitting, rested while working, and turned chores into rituals. Imagine a woman brushing wool before dawn, her feet warmed by a sleepy dog, the mist outside icing the window, slats and a pot of barley bubbling beside her. This is not luxury. This is human coziness, handmade from effort and time. Comfort foods before they were called. That what did you eat when the wind howled outside? The same foods, over and over, and in comforting ways. Porridge thick, warm, sometimes sweetened with a stolen apple stew, lentils, onions, maybe a little rabbit if you were lucky, bread dense, chewy, sour, served with lard or butter, just enough to stay edible in winter or mild room temp. Nourishing meals weren't served in courses. They were scooped, ladled, shared, and no one ate alone if they could help it, because company was flavored. That the soundtrack of cozy. What did cozy sound like in a world before clocks? The crackle of fire, the swish of wool skirts, the low murmur of prayer, the clink of spoons in wooden bowls, the breath of animals sleeping nearby, the hiss of rain on thatched, click of spinning wheels, the rhythmic clop of someone sharpening a blade. In this world, even noise was soft. You weren't woken by alarms. You were woken by bread smells and bird song, clothes that hugged no fitted coats, no elastic, no fasteners you couldn't fix yourself. Instead, wraps, ties, laces, pins, folds. Clothing was adjustable, layered, and meant to move with youth, sleep, work, weather, and growth. Wool tunics doubled as blankets. Cloaks became tents. Hoods framed faces like halos. In winter, people wore their bedding all day, and if it rained, they simply added another layer, or removed one to share. Fashion. Perhaps not, but functionally lovable. The kindness of close quarters medieval homes were small, but that meant you weren't far from anyone, and in winter, this was good. Children heard bedtime stories from both parents at once. Grandparents offered wisdom without needing to walk across the house. Even the chickens under the floorboards gave a sense of life going on. Privacy is overrated. when survival is shared, and in this world, warmth was community. So tuck in now Yoa, wrapped in layers now wool against skin, linen at your feet, firelight on your face. You smell stew, you hear wind, but you are dry, and your house breathes warmth. No one rushes, no one hurries. Even the fire crackles with intention. Because here, in the so-called Dark Ages, people built a version of cozy so resilient, it has lasted through centuries of weather, war, and worry. So close your eyes now, let the day cool, let the room flicker. You are not alone. You are warm, and the world, for a moment, is kind. The candles have burned low, the bread is wrapped, the animals have been fed, and the fire has settled into a slow red glow. The door is latched, the shutters drawn. It is night in the Dark Ages, and night is very long. In a world before electric light, nighttime was not just an absence of sun, it was a season of its own. It brought with it new rules, new rituals, and an entirely different rhythm of life. You didn't sleep as we do now. You didn't dream alone. Tonight, you'll drift through the strange, soft world of medieval sleep. Split slumber, shared dreams, whispered prayers, and the company of mice behind the wall. 2 sleeps, not one. Forget the 8-hour block of modern sleep. In the Dark Ages, people practiced segmented sleep, what we might call first sleep and second sleep. The pattern went like this: fall asleep soon after nightfall, around 8 p.m. Wake naturally a few hours later, sometime after midnight. Stay awake for an hour or two, then drift into second sleep until dawn. During that midnight wakeful window, called the watch, or the quiet, people read, prayed, talked, made love, stoked fires, tended infants, or simply thought. It was a time for gentle things. The world was dark, but the mind was clear. A room shared by many. Most people did not sleep alone, nor in separate rooms. Entire families, sometimes with guests or animals, shared a common sleeping space. Bed frames were rare. Straw pallets or raised wooden platforms were more common. The warmth of bodies mattered more than the space between them. Children slept with siblings, parents with infants, servants at their master's feet, travelers on the floor near the hearth. This was not just practical, it was emotional protection. When the wind howled and the fire dimmed, it helped to hear your brother's slow breathing or your grandmother's soft humming. Night was safer when shared. The sounds of medieval night in the Dark Ages had its own soundscape. The steady crackle of fire, the shuffle of livestock beneath the floorboards, the hoot of owls. Far off in trees, the low creak of roof beams, someone coughing softly in sleepdogs, turning in circles before settling, the faint rustle of rats in the grain sack sand. Over it all, silence profound, velvety silence. You couldn't fill the dark with entertainment. You filled it with presence. Sleep was never about escape. It was a place you went together. Dreaming was a communal art in the morning. Dreams were shared like gossip. Dreams were thought to carry meanings, sometimes divine, sometimes ominous, sometimes just amusing. I dreamt my teeth fell out. Someone might say, so maybe someone will die. I dreamt I was flying over the fields. Another would reply, so I think the barley will grow well. Villagers told dreams like stories. They interpreted one another's visions, sometimes consulting folk guides passed down orally. A black bird meant sadness, a broken shoe meant travel, a clean river meant good health, a kiss meant nothing but was fun to dream. The act of dreaming tied you to the community. even more deeply than waking did. Night was not for idleness in those quiet, wakeful midnight hours. Much got done. A woman might finish spinning the day's wool. A man might sharpen tools for tomorrow's sowing. A child might murmur prayers with eyes barely open. Lamps were costly, but firelight was always there, and so the watchful hours became a gentle intermission, not insomnia, but an expected pause. In the performance of sleep, some wrote letters by flickering light. Others whispered secrets they wouldn't say in daytime. This was the hour for the softest confessions, the truest regrets, the kindest touches, and then, almost imperceptibly, they drifted back into their second sleep. The blessings of sleep. Charms not. Everyone found sleep easy, so medieval folk developed their own rituals, sleep charms, whispered incantations, and gentle practices to soothe the restless. A mother might sing a child to sleep with a rhyme that named each star. A farmer might hang a piece of bread above the bed to ward off bad dreams. A woman might wrap her hair in rosemary before sleep, to dream of the man she'd marry. There were herbs, valerian for rest, chamomile for peace, mugwort for dreams, and there were prayers, so many prayers. May the angels guard my soul while I lie in shadow. May the black dog pass my door. Let the holy silence come upon me. The darkness was not feared. Always it's easy to imagine medieval people feared the night. And sometimes they did, but more often they respected it. They knew the dangers, wolves, thieves, illness, fire. But they also knew the peace of darkness. In candlelight, faces softened, voices lowered, chores stopped. There was no pressure to do more. The world could wait. Even gossip took a rest. Even the chickens tucked their beaks under their wings. Darkness wasn't the enemy. It was the blanket over the day. The soft duties of the night watch. Someone always stayed half awake. A parent with a new baby. An old man with stiff joints. A widow. Used to waking. These people became unofficial night watchers, listening for creaks, tending the fire, adding straw to a restless sleeper's bedding. It wasn't a job. It was a rhythm. And in this way, sleep became not just personal, but communal, even in dreams. Someone was watching over you. When the rooster sang, the rooster didn't just wake you up. He sang you back into the world. His crossrill and the first embers of the day had begun. Soon you'd smell porridge. Soon you'd hear hooves in the lane. Soon the village would be moving again. But for a moment, as you blink in the still dim light and stretch cold fingers beneath the wool, you are still there in that hush, in that in-between world, between firelight and sunlight, between dreams and labor, and it's beautiful. So sleep, knowing you are watched tonight. The world is slow. You share your room, your blanket, your breath, your stories, and you know, somewhere in the dark, someone is tending the fire. Someone is praying beside you. Someone is dreaming of you. You do not sleep alone. You do not dream alone. The night may be long, but it is full of warmth, of silence, of you. You are sitting, not working, not praying, not even sleeping, just sitting. Your hands rest in your lap. Your feet are near the fire. You are not bored. You are not ashamed. You are practicing the ancient art of doing nothing. And here, in the quieter corners of the so-called Dark Ages, this is not laziness. This is life. Because not every moment was spent tilling fields or fixing roofs. Some were spent being with the air, with the sheep, with your own slow thoughts, and with the way the wind nudges the thatch just so. This section is not about doing more. It's about the skill it took to do less. The myth of constant labor. Modern minds often imagine medieval life as endless toil, from dawn to dusk, bent backs, calloused hands, hunger nipping at every shadow. And yes, labor was real. It was hard. It was constant at times, but it wasn't non-stop, in fact. Many medieval peasants worked fewer hours per year than today's full-time laborers. Sundays were sacred, feast days abounded, rainy days brought pauses. Long winters meant shortened tasks. There was no clock to race, no inbox to empty, no productivity to optimize. Instead, there were hours to sit, watch, wait, and that too was a form of survival. Watching the world work when you have no machines. Your tools are your eyes. So villagers became watchers. They watched the sky to guess when the rains might end to find the right star that rises before spring, to catch the subtle light that means planting can begin. They watched animals. A cow twitching at flies may mean fevery. Birds circling low may mean prey. Nearby a cat grooming itself by the hearth may mean a dry day. Tomorrow they watched one another. Who limps today? Who didn't yesterday? Who is quiet at the communal oven? Who sings while spinning? And who doesn't? Doing nothing was not absence. It was attention. Crafting in silence. Much of life was done with hands, but not much noise. Spinning thread, chipping wood, carding wool, weaving stroll. These were slow, repetitive acts, and they invited silence, or sometimes song. Not performance, but hums, droning ballads, lullabies with no child listening, songs about butter, or rain, or foxes stealing eggs, and in between, long, lovely pauses. The wool was soft, the work was warm, and the silence belonged. No one asked you to talk. No one needed you to smile. You were present. That was enough. The fireside seat. Every home had one seat closest to the fire. It was not the highest ranking chair or the softest. It was simply the warmest, and it often belonged to the grandmother who told the oldest stories, the uncle with the sore leg, the boy too sick to help in the fields, the guest passing through with tired eyes. And once there, you didn't need to speak, or help, or offer anything. You just sat, and the room shaped itself around you. Sometimes someone would place a blanket over your knees without a word. That was medieval. Kindness, a quiet place to be. Sitting and thinking or not. They had no journals, number, therapists, no Headspace app, so reflection came during small gaps. A shepherd on a hillside, listening to the sheep. A mother stirring porridge, remembering her own childhood. A monk copying texts, pausing to stretch his fingers and stare at the light. They didn't call it mindfulness, but they knew, instinctively, that being still mattered, because in stillness, you noticed things you forgave, things you remembered, things you planned, things saw you forgot everything and just existed. Was sacred. The bench outside most homes had a small bench or flat stone near the door. This was where you sat when you didn't know what else to do. You sat to mend things, rest your back, greet neighbors, watch clouds, think about the next planting due. None of those things. Children sat here to pout. Old men sat here to nap. It was not productive. It was essential, because you need a place to simply be in the weather, to see what the day looks like, to breathe without effort. And in winter, with a fur over your lap, it was a throne. The long, slow feast days. There were many. You didn't work. You rested. This meant sitting round a table or a low mat, eating slowly, chatting gently, maybe playing a pipe or telling riddles. There was no entertainment, no performances, just people being around each other with slightly better food. And after eating, a nap, a walk, a prayer, or more sitting, because to celebrate meant not to rush. It meant letting the body breathe, and to breathe was sacred. When doing nothing was listening. Even in churches, not everyone followed every word of the Latin sermon. Sometimes you just listened to the sound of voices. You let your mind drift. You stared at candlelight. You counted the patterns in the stained glass. You tried not to sneeze. Doing nothing in church wasn't disrespect. It was a form of soft attendance. You showed up. You listened in your way, and that was enough. Sleep as sacred stillness. Sleep itself was a form of doing nothing well. You didn't use sleep to recover from busyness. You used it to stay whole. Sleep was earned, cherished, protected. No screens, no lights, no alarms, just firelight, cool air, a cloak over your shoulders, and the peace of having done just enough. Nothing more was asked of you. So sit back and drift. The pot is simmering. The wind is quiet. The chores are done, or they can wait. Your body is tired, but not aching. Your eyes are soft. No one is calling your name. Nothing is expected. You are doing nothing. And that is exactly what you need. Sleep now, not as an escape, but as a continuation of this lovely stillness. The fire will burn a little longer, and your body knows. The art of doing nothing well is the oldest art of all. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a world of candlelit monasteries, slow-turning water wheels, wool cloaks drying near the fire, and quiet minds copying ancient words by hand. This is the image that never makes the textbooks, because for centuries, the Dark Ages have been described as a time of decay, ignorance, and silences. If the light of Rome had gone out, and no one dared strike a match until the Renaissance. But that's not quite true. In fact, it's not true at all. In this final section, we'll gently brush the dust off the misnamed Dark Ages and show you the soft glow that never really faded, only changed hue. The world didn't stop. It slowed, and sometimes slowing is how light survives. The phrase was an invention. Let's begin at the beginning, not the 5th century, but the 14th. It was Italian poet Petrarch who coined the term Dark Ages, not as a fact, but as an opinion. He missed the glory of ancient Rome, and thought everything in between was ... embarrassing. Later, historians ran with it, but the people living in the so-called Dark Ages didn't think they were in darkness. They lit fires, they sang songs, they improved tools, they spoke prayers, they read books, yes, books. Darkness, as it turns out, was more of a metaphor than a fact. Light came from monasteries. When cities declined, learning didn't vanish. It moved. Monasteries became libraries, monks became scribes, and in those candlelit rooms, ancient texts were copied letter, by hand, by heart. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, herbal medicine, astronomy, Psalms. Each book copied was a thread of light, sewn into the future. It was slow, painstaking, sometimes boring, and that's what saved it. No one rushed, no one edited for profit. They simply preserved. The monks weren't inventors, they were guardians of light. Science didn't stop contrary to popular belief. The early medieval world didn't reject science, it just had a different relationship with it. People still studied the stars, still measured time, still grew medicinal herbs, still experimented with dyes, metallurgy, glassmaking, and architecture. Water wheels improved. Agricultural tools evolved. Math was taught not in Latin, but in Arabic numerals borrowed from the Islamic world. Even eyeglasses were invented in the 13th century, toward the tail end of the so-called Dark Age. They weren't afraid of knowledge. They were just careful with it. Trade routes didn't vanish. The Silk Roads still buzzed quietly. Spices came westward. Furs traveled south. Ideas moved more slowly, but they moved. Pilgrims crossed mountains. Traders bartered in coastal towns. Jewish and Muslim merchants connected continents. Even Viking raiders eventually became Viking merchants, bringing amber, soapstone, and stories with them. It wasn't a globalized world, but it wasn't an isolated one either. The world whispered softly, steadily, across borders and languages. Art never slept. If you ever visit an early medieval chapel, look closely at the stone. You'll find spirals, creatures, saints, sometimes just patterns that feel like dreaming. Art in the Dark Ages was different, less realistic, more symbolic, but it never stopped. People embroidered stories, painted saints, wove colors into wool. Carvings appeared on wooden spoons. Tunes traveled from harp to harp. Beauty existed not for museums, but for presence. To feel, to remember, to praise. Dark. Not quite. Dim, maybe, like twilight. Women wrote, healed, taught, though often hidden in the footnotes. Women played critical roles in keeping medieval society thoughtful and functional. Some were midwives, trusted more than physicians. Some were herbalists, their gardens full of remedies. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, composed music, wrote theology, and studied the stars. Convents became centers of education for women. Girls learned Latin, scripture, and sometimes poetry. They weren't loud. They weren't always recognized, but they worked in quiet, life-saving ways, the kind of light that flickers, never burns out. The Islamic world lit the horizon while parts of Europe slowed. The Islamic world bloomed. From Cordoba to Baghdad, scholars translated Aristotle, calculated planetary motion, invented surgical tools, and catalogued medicinal herbs. These texts sound the wisdom they carried, flowed slowly into Europe over centuries, far from being forgotten. Ancient knowledge was preserved and extended just, not always in the same places. And when Europe was ready, the bridge was already built. The Dark Ages were not empty. They were bridging centuries. Cathedrals grew stone by stone. If you stand inside an early medieval church, tilt your head upward, you're seeing not just architecture, but patience carved in stone. Gothic cathedrals began to rise in the later medieval centuries, but even before that, builders knew light mattered. Stained glass, vaults, arches, shadows. The buildings invited people to sit, breathe, and wonder. No rush, no applause, just a place to be small under something beautifully large. Humor, to survived one of the best-kept secrets of the Dark Ages. They were funny. Margins of manuscripts are filled with bizarre, whimsical illustrations, snails fighting night scats, playing lute monks with fish heads and rabbits. So many rabbits doing suspiciously human things. Why? Because even scribes got bored, and because humor is a form of light. Even in dim centuries, people needed to laugh, and they did, a slow light, not an absent one, what made the Dark Ages feel dark. To later minds was not the total absence of light, but its slowness. Progress did not leap. It walked. Books did not print. They were copied. Ideas did not shout. They whispered. but the light was there. In a candle on a monk's desk, mother singing a harvest song, a wheel turning in a village, stream, a sheep's wool being spun into warmth, a quiet prayer before sleep. Light was present in the ordinary, and that's what makes it powerful. So let the light settle in as you close this chapter. Know this: the dark ages weren't dark. They were soft, slow, resilient, and above all, human. You are not drifting off in ignorance. You are drifting through a history that still glows, Malay warmly, like firelight in a small cottage. And as you rest now, imagine someone long ago doing the same, wrapped in wool, listening to wind, knowing that morning would come, because it always did. It was early spring along the misty hills outside Byzantium, not Constantinople, not Istanbul, but Byzantium, before the grand mosaics, before the gleaming domes, when the sea still whispered in Greek and Latin and birds wheeled over red-tinged tile roofs. The fields, then, were humble, rolling with pale shrubs, the occasional fig tree, and of course, rows and rows of olive groves. If you walk slowly through them in your imagination now, you'll find the cracked bark and twisted trunks are already centuries old, even in this ancient time. And among these groves walked Myrene, a teenage olive picker with calloused hands and a voice that hummed like a spinning spindle. She was not noble, she was not a myth, she was ordinary, and that's why she matters. Let's follow her, just for a while, through the dusty rows of olive trees where the wind liked to listen. Myrene's morning she rose with the birds. No curtains in the stone hut she shared with her grandmother, just the smell of stored garlic and sea damp. Her bed was a low pallet of straw stuffed in a frame built by an uncle she no longer remembered. Myrene stretched, scratched her knee, and tied her linen scarf tight over her hair. The first job was always kindling the small hearth. The fire was more smoke than heat, but it was enough to warm the chunk of barley bread left over from the day before. Her grandmother had once been a dyer of cloth. Now she mostly sat in the doorway and told stories to anyone who had brought her figs. Myrene dipped her bread in some vinegar-thinned olive oil. Then, as always, she reached for the old basket patched 3 times, over and walked barefoot toward the trees. The grove of quiet conversations, the olive grove wasn't far, just a short climb above the village road. Other girls and women were already there, bending, lifting, whispering. There were no songs sung aloud, not in the way theatre might suggest. Just small hums, half memory, half melody slipping from Myrene's throat as she worked. The olives were still green, not yet swollen, but her task wasn't harvest. It was pruning, gathering fallen branches, chasing off bugs with a smelly mixture of ash and vinegar. There was a kind of peace to it. Every leaf she touched felt older than her. Every tree was a gossiping elder. Some villagers said you could tell how well the empire was doing by how full the olive trees looked. But Myrene didn't know anything about emperors. She knew about knees in the dirt, the sting of vinegar in cut skin, and the softness of olive leaves against the palm, the quiet between empires you see. This was Byzantium before its renaming, before Justinian, before Theodora danced in purple robes. It was a sleepy little trade town, where Greek merchants drank cheap wine. Roman officials complained about taxes, and sailors passed gossip to the goats. Even so, the air buzzed with transition. Latin and Greek coexisted awkwardly. Taxes were collected reluctantly. Faiths were changing silently. But none of that mattered to Myrene, at least, not yet. She just worked and hummed, and sometimes paused to imagine the hills listening back. A boy who delivered salt that day near noon. She saw someone at the edge of the grove. A boy, maybe her age, maybe younger, with one broken sandal and a sack over his shoulder. He was from the salt pots near the inlet. His name, she'd later learn, was Leon, but for now, he just stood there, watching. He wasn't leering, just curious. Maybe a little lost. Marine wiped her hands on her hem and went back to pruning. After a moment, she realized she was still humming. He didn't walk away. When words weren't needed, they didn't speak that day. Just watched each other from a respectful distance. He dropped off his sack at the supervisor's shed and lingered by a cart. Then, as if embarrassed, he pretended to look at the sky, the bark, the ants, anything. Moraine tried to focus on her work, but her humming stopped. And for the first time, the olive grove felt less quiet and more awake. Was it curiosity, loneliness, a hint of something gentler? That evening, while washing her arms in the stream, she caught herself humming again, slower, softer. The kind of tune that carries further than you think. The city that never slept but sometimes dozed. Byzantium, from her windowless hut, looked like a cluster of tired rooftops. But beyond the hills lay constant movement. Traders, scribes, wine sellers, tailors, soldiers, living in the gaps between empires. She had never seen the hippodrome. She had never touched a coin with an emperor's face. But every evening, she listened to the faint murmur of the city carried on sea wind. It sounded like breathing, a prick of something new. The next morning, Leon was there again. This time, he brought dried figs. Said they were for the olive girl with songs. She blushed and dropped one fig into the dirt by accident. He shrugged. The ground can have one. Marine looked at him properly then, dusty, cheek smudged with salt, and smiling without knowing how to smile fully. They didn't talk much more, but the space between them felt warmer, and when she returned to her work, her hums had changed, minor key but hopeful. Even the olive trees seemed to tilt slightly in her direction. The next week brought a shift in weather, cooler mornings, windier afternoons. The olives, too, had begun their slow darkening, and the harvest supervisor grumbled about pests and mold. But Marine hardly noticed the fruit she was listening for. Footsteps. Leon came every other day now, always with a reason, a delivery, a message, a second-hand tunic for her grandmother, too small for my uncle, he claimed. But he never stayed long, just enough to say a few words, share a fig or a smile, and watch Marine hum her way through the trees. They didn't call it anything. Not friendship, not flirtation. It was quieter than that, like the sound of dry leaves brushing in wind. A cart with a crooked wheel one late afternoon. As Marine tugged dead branches into a pile, she heard the wobble squeak of a cart. Leon was struggling with an overloaded salt cart. The wheel leaned sideways, like it had grown tired of being useful. "Let me guess," she said, walking over. "Too much salt, too little wheel." He looked up and grinned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. Or maybe the olives are jealous. She laughed, a small, surprised sound that caught even her off guard. Then, before she could retreat to the safety of silence, she said, "Want help?" He blinked. "You push, I steer." "No," she said. "Picking up a rock, I hammer, you fix." Lessons in patience. It took 2 tries and a prayer to an obscure saint neither of them believed in. But they got the wheel wedged back into place. Marine's hands were black with dust. Leon's knees were soaked from a puddle he hadn't noticed. They sat beside the cart for a while, sipping watered-down vinegar from his leather flask. He offered her a piece of honeyed bread, and she broke it in half. "Do you ever go to the city?" she asked, mouth half full. "Sometimes. I hate it." "Why?" "Too many coins. Not enough hills." She nodded. "And you," he asked, "ever?" "Been to the harbor?" "Only in my dreams." "Do you dream in salt or in olives?" She didn't answer, but later that night, she dreamed of a boy with salt in his hair and her hum in his hands. The garden under the wallow. Week later, Leon showed her a walled garden behind an old storehouse near the city's edge. No one used it anymore, not since. The merchant who planted it fled during a tax scandal. There, wild fennel grew between fallen urns. Bees buzzed around bruised mint. A broken water jar had become home to a frog the size of a small lemon. They sat on a toppled bench beneath the wall. The city skyline peered at them from above. Towers, cranes, banners. He asked her to hum again. "Why?" She said, embarrassed, "Because the wind listens better when you do." So she did, just for a minute, and the leaves didn't rustle louder. The bees didn't pause. But something unseen in the world took notice. Secrets stored in baskets by this point. Marine's grandmother was asking questions. "Who's that boy who brings bread with no price?" Marine shrugged. "A salt deliverer." "Does he bring you salt or sweetness?" "Neither. Just small things." Her grandmother narrowed her eyes in the firelight. "The smallest things last longest." Marine pretended not to understand what the olive trees remembered. The olive trees didn't change. They were still ancient, bent, secretive things, but Marine began to think of them differently as witnesses. Every time she hummed, every time Leon appeared with a new reason to linger, she imagined the trees were nodding quietly. "You like him?" One branch might have whispered. "I like the way he waits." She would have replied, because Leon never rushed her, never asked for more. He just showed up and smiled like someone who knew the value of stillness. An old coin and a broken tile one morning. While clearing brush near the southern hill, Leon handed her a tiny object wrapped in linen. "What's this?" "Found it by the seawall," he said. She unwrapped it. An old bronze coin, too worn to read, but smooth from years of tide and touch. Alongside it, a broken tile with a faded mosaic half of what might have been a fish or a ship. They matched, he said. Moraine stared at them, unsure what to say. "It's nothing," he added. "Just felt like something you'd like." She closed the cloth slowly, held it against her chest. "It's not nothing," she said, and that was the first time their fingers brushed. When the sky looked like the sea that evening, clouds swept low across the hills. The air grew cold and damp. It smelled like wet earth and faraway thunder. They met in the abandoned garden again. Beneath the crumbling wall, neither spoke for a long time. The sky turned from grey to charcoal. Then Leon said, "When I was small, I thought the clouds were the sea and the stars were fish." Marine smiled. "Maybe they are." They didn't kiss. That wasn't their rhythm. But their shoulders touched, and the frog in the broken jar made a satisfied croak, as if blessing the moment. The early summer heat came suddenly. The olives swelled, their skin glossy in the golden light. Bees thickened in the air. The dust clung harder to skin, and Marine hummed less, partly from the heat, partly from the worry. Leon hadn't come. In 3 days. Not for salt, not for bread, not even to say nothing and wait quietly. She tried not to show it. Her fingers still moved over olive branches. her shoulders still bent beneath baskets. But the trees noticed, because the trees, after all, had been watching the whole time. A letter from a harbour clerk. It was the fourth day of silence when the message came. A boy, much younger than Leon, red-faced and barefoot, handed her a folded scrap of bark paper while she was washing tools at the stream. It read, "They sent me east to help a merchant with broken ledgers. I told them I was no good with numbers, but they needed someone who could lift crates and not steal wine. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't know how to. I hope you're still humming." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Moraine folded the note carefully and slid it into the lining of her basket, where she kept dry leaves, feathers, and lost buttons. Then she sat by the stream, humming very softly. Byzantium doesn't pause for olive girls. The city did what cities do. Byzantium carried on. Markets opened, boats docked. Scribal assistants argued about taxes. Thieves blamed the weather. Bakers burned the tops of their loaves and sold them anyway. And out in the olive groves, Moraine worked. But something inside her was not still, not sad, exactly. Just slower. She stopped, visiting the garden. The frog, presumably, moved on. The grand nothing. Some weeks later, a distant relative offered her work in a dye house closer to the port. It was better pay, they said. Cleaner too, though. That was a lie. Nothing involving crushed snails and boiling cauldrons was ever clean. She considered it, even walked there once. But when she reached the door, she stood outside and stared at the clouds above the harbour. The same ones Leon once said looked like the sea, and instead of stepping in, she walked back to the groves. Things left behind in trees. You might think this is a sad ending, a story that wilted in the sun. But consider this. Moraine never forgot the boy who brought figs, the broken tile, the question about cloud-fish, and the olive trees, those twisting, silent elders held onto the memory like they held onto roots, years later. Long after Byzantium was renamed and reconquered and built again, an old woman still worked that grove. She wore a scarf. She hummed in the mornings. And once, when a child asked her why, she said, "Because the wind used to listen." A note from the future historians won't tell you this story. There are no surviving records of Moraine or Leon. No statues, no street names. No epic poems, but empires are not made only by kings and generals. They are held together quietly by girls who hum to trees and boys who wait without asking.